No.
Yeah. We're in public session. I would like to welcome members and also viewers who may be watching our proceedings on Oireachtas TV for the third public session of the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Climate Action. Before I introduce our witnesses today, at the request of the Broadcasting and Recording Services, members and visitors in the public gallery are requested to ensure that your mobile phones are switched off or onto flight mode as they interfere with the sound system. So I'd like to extend a very warm welcome on behalf of the committee to Mr. Fabian Kuster from the European Cyclists Federation, Mr. Brian Deegan from Urban Movement, and Dr. Rachel Aldred from the University of Westminster. So before we commence formal proceedings, I wish to advise the witnesses that by virtue of Section 17(2)(l) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. If you're directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you're entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You're directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you're asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that where possible you should not criticise or make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. And finally, members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary standing ruling of the Chair to the effect that members should not comment on or criticise or make charges against a person outside the House or an official by name or in such ways to make him or her identifiable. I'll now call on Mr. Fabian Kuster to make your opening statement. Is that okay, or would somebody else want to start?
We had this internally discussed before, and we would like to start with Rachel, if that's okay for you.
No problem.
Yeah.
Dr. Aldred, thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. So I have 4 points I basically want to make in this lead-off. Firstly, the scope for increasing active travel in Ireland. So sometimes people think that there's no scope to shift to walking and cycling because trips made are too long, but I think it's worth pointing out that 57% of trips made in Ireland are under 8 kilometres, and even if we exclude Dublin residents whose trips tend to be shorter, 50% of trips made by people living in Ireland are under 8 kilometres. So there's a lot of scope, but at the moment 3/4 of trips are made by car, as are 2/3 of trips even in densely populated areas. When we look at the shortest trips, half of all trips under 2 kilometres are driven, as are 2/3 of all trips between 2 and 4 kilometres. And the mode share for walking is 15% and for cycling 2%. So you can see there's a big gap between current levels of active travel and what might be possible. And for longer trips, there's the potential for e-bikes for trips of 8 kilometres or above in particular, or hilly trips, so Fabian's going to talk more about that. And for longer trips, active travel and public transport can be mutually supportive. So I think my first point is there's a lot of scope to get more people walking and cycling here. And there's a need for change. So when we think about emissions reductions, technological change is not going to be enough to meet policy goals over the short time frames necessary. We need that technological change, but we also need substantial behaviour change. So cleaner vehicles, but also fewer vehicles. And we also should be thinking about co-benefits. So strategies to avoid climate crisis should also maximise the co-benefits, the additional benefits, and minimise the disbenefits. And if we think about increasing active travel, increasing walking and cycling, then there are really major co-benefits that we can get from this that you don't get from just a switch to cleaner fuels, for example. So physical activity, health benefits. Whenever we look, studies look at a shift to active travel, to walking and cycling, there are always really major health benefits from getting more people physically active. We also have a physical inactivity crisis. Better access to jobs and services for people on lower incomes. Very often people who are living on low incomes are struggling to afford a car, struggling to afford public transport. If walking and cycling is possible for these people, they can have much more opportunities. And also children's independence. If we look at what's happened in many European countries to children's independence, over the past few decades, children who used to be able to roam freely are now often basically prisoners in their own homes because they're not able to get out and about because of the risk from motor traffic. Also older people. We should be thinking about older people and independence through the life course. There's a whole range of benefits from more walking and cycling. But can we get this change? So it's often easy to think that, okay, you know, there's lots of trips of 8 kilometres or below, there's lots of scope, but, you know, we don't have a culture of walking or of cycling. You know, can we really get this shift? And I think the good thing is that evidence increasingly shows that we can make a difference, even in car-dependent contexts, even in contexts that have lost lost their culture of cycling, for instance. And it's really about improving conditions for active travel and making car use less attractive. And I know Brian's going to talk more about the detail of this. But for instance, if we look at a city level, then if we look at London, for instance, over the past 20 years, London saw its population increase by 2 million. So all the models, all the transport models would predict a big increase in car trips. More income, more population, more car trips. But this didn't happen. Car trips didn't grow. They actually declined slightly despite having 2 million extra people. And the mode share for trips driven fell by 52% to 38%. So that is a major shift. This is possible. But there's also evidence, academic evidence from studies looking at specific interventions. So just to give you one example, there's something in Cambridge, in England, called the Cambridge Busway Cycleway. And that has been shown to lead to increased active travel, increased walking cycling. Particularly, it goes through rural areas. Particularly in those rural areas, people particularly increase their walking cycling, and particularly households with children. And my own work has found that in neighbourhoods in outer London, restricting motor vehicle access through neighbourhoods has led to a 20% reduction in past week car use for residents in those areas. So we have evidence these things work. So just to finish with how to get this change. So motor traffic. Evidence shows that motor traffic is really the fundamental barrier to getting more people walking and cycling. People don't want to mix with motor traffic. And the problem remains with electric vehicles. Electric vehicles may be more pleasant to interact with than vehicles belching diesel fumes, but they're still a problem for walking and cycling. And for cycling, we need a step change. We need safe, separated cycleways on major roads. That evidence is now, there's a consensus on this, really. And minor roads are only really cycle-friendly if there's very low levels of speeds and volumes of motor traffic. A residential road is not necessarily somewhere people will let their kids cycle if there's lots of cars cutting through. One point I particularly wanted to make was that car-dominated environments particularly dissuade women from cycling, and also other underrepresented groups and people travelling with children, which again is something that may affect gender balance. And I think it's worth considering that safe cycle infrastructure may fall under the public sector equality and human rights duty, because if you do not have environments that enable cycling, women, older people, children and so on are disproportionately put off from cycling. For walking, many European countries, we already have a basic footway network, but there's still a lot of change that needs to happen, and it's around reducing amounts, speeds and dominance of motor traffic. So that can increase levels of walking and improve the walking experience and free up space to put in benches, green space and so on. And again, there's an equalities issue. This will particularly benefit disabled pedestrians who are at disproportionate risk of being injured by motor vehicles, my research has found. And just one final point, that given we have an urgent need for change and we have major political challenges in many contexts facing implementation, then I think it's worth considering the use of trials and temporary interventions. These can be quick, effective and provide crucial data early on about what works and what may need to be adapted in a given context. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aldred. Mr. Kuster, do you want to go next?
Yes, that's fine for me. So, good afternoon. Thank you very much for this invitation. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. So I also want to kick off my presentation by giving a bit of a context to where we are with levels of cycling in Europe. So if you look at this chart from the 2014 Eurobarometer asking people on a typical day which mode of transport you use most often, the European average response rate to bicycle was at 8%. Ireland you will find at the third left column, so standing at 2%. And the European champion, the Netherlands, was at 36%. So there's a factor of 1 to 80 between Ireland and the Netherlands. So while there's certainly a considerable margin of error in this data, I think we all agreed, as Rachel already highlighted, there's a high potential, high unused potential here in Ireland to grow cycling. Now, I think an excellent occasion to make that commitment to grow cycling would have been in the draft National Energy and Climate Plan, which member states had to submit by the end of 2018 to the European Commission. So we made an analysis of these 28 draft NECPs, and we have to come to the conclusion that Ireland here missed an opportunity to better position cycling as an effective tool to help decarbonize the transport sector. Obviously, you're in good company. Many countries didn't score very well, but still it was a missed opportunity. Now, we also looked at your national climate plan, which I understand just came out last week, and I think here the picture is much, much better for cycling. I was particularly intrigued by action number 97, commence full implementation of the National Cycle Policy Framework, which is listed as an annex to the National Climate Plan. And there's one sentence that caught my attention. The last one, current transport infrastructure programs to immediately be revised to achieve at least 10% expenditure on facilitating cycling. I think that would be really a game changer if you invested 10% of your transport investments in cycling. Just to put this into context, the Netherlands, the European champion, invests about 7%. So you would go above that level. Obviously, the Netherlands has been doing this for many, many years. They started investing in cycling 40 years ago. They never went below a 15% cycling mode share, so they always had a higher starting point, a better starting point. But still, it would be a major step into the right direction if you took that choice. So I also want to applaud you on your plans to go electric, but I think here there's one big omission in your strategy, namely that is leaving out the electric bicycle. Yeah, we know that the e-bike has a certain element of comfort. It brings more people to cycling. They cycle more often, longer distances. It's an opener for commuters, for the elderly, for the less fit people, for people living in hilly areas. So if there's one vehicle that has potential to substitute car trips, it's the e-bike, certainly in areas where there's low coverage of public transport. And also if you think about freight deliveries in cities, the e-cargo bike really is a great solution for first and last mile deliveries. Just on this chart, you see really that the e-bike market is developing rapidly. We saw in 2017 already more than 2 million e-bikes being sold in the EU. There's an average growth rate of 22% between 2015 and 2017. And if that trend continued for the next 11 years, we would see sales of 30 million units just in the year 2030. So there's really huge potential across Europe. Why is the market growing? One reason, because some member states have given financial incentives for e-bikes. So, for example, France introduces €200 purchase subsidy. And you see that the sales figures between 2016 and 2017 almost doubled, just due to this subsidy. They also did an ex-post analysis with people who bought this e-bike. And I found that 61% of new e-bike trips replace car trips. So there's really a big potential to get people here out of your car. Second, I understand that Irish employees can get a bicycle from the employer every 5 years, and that this policy is fiscally stimulated. But if I'm informed correctly, there's a cap on the price of the bicycle, which is €1,000. So effectively, you're excluding e-bikes here. Yeah. So it would be an idea to raise that cap. Also, Belgium, so if you want to go this extra mile, you might consider something that Belgium, for example, has been doing is introducing a cycle allowance for commuters. So for every kilometer you cycle to and from work, the employer can pay the employee 23 euro cents tax-free. So, for example, I live 7 kilometers from my work. I get about 60 to 70 euros every month tax-free from my employer. And I think that's a nice stimulus. You see that cycling to work has been increasing by more than 40% over the last 12 years in Belgium. Third recommendation I would give, obviously, bicycles, e-bikes are expensive. They need to be parked easily and safely. So it's really crucial to get that piece of infrastructure right. You see, we did this European comparative analysis of how member states are regulating off-street bicycle parking. We found that lots of 6 member states have minimum national laws in place, whereas Ireland only gives non-binding guidelines. So I think also you could be inspired here by what other member states have been doing. So I want to conclude on that note. I think you have done a good job with the draft or with the climate action plan, but regarding electromobility, there is room for improvement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pfister. Mr. Brian Deegan.
Oh, that goes on. Sorry, yeah. Yeah, excellent. I think we're probably all agreed that active travel is the key to climate change and one of the clearest methods we have of tackling it in there. But I really want to talk about some other issues to start with as well. It's also like a health, a safety and a social justice issue. That's certainly been helping us make the case in the UK. And I'll tell about my personal experience before I get into the more technical side of it. I was raised in a place called Moss Side in Manchester, quite a kind of rough inner city area. When I was young there, it was all cobbled and I used to play on the streets and play football. I'm sure, looking at the nodding faces around the room, we all had similar kind of childhoods of playing out there. One day, in the name of progress, it was asphalted. Put down and I was like, what's this new stuff that's arrived on the street? Suddenly it became quite difficult to play football because you couldn't get out of the cars in time at the space then, and it no longer became a place to play. A friend of mine, Stephen, got run over by a car. He didn't get killed, but it made it very difficult for him to concentrate, and he kind of slipped out of school, and there was social problems with it. The other parents then said, what are we doing letting our kids play outside there when all these cars are speeding down there? They started bringing the children back into the houses. I'm sure we all recognise this. Only the kind of bad kids were left outside, kids like myself in there. We skip on a few years. This is all in the late 70s, going into the early 80s. Really, the presence of a young person on the street in Moss Side meant that you were up to no good. And basically the police started coming around, throwing us in the back of vans and beating us just for being on the street. That's how socially uncohesive it got there. Eventually one kid got killed, the riots started, all the streets burned down, all the shops smashed in there, and that's my personal experience of the design of streets, and that's one of the things that led it. I know it's a powerful start, and I see some faces going, where's this going? And I will get to the technical thing in there, but what I want to get over in this first bit is the way we design the streets has a very strong effect on people's lives, and we've got to acknowledge that we can create behaviours just by a simple change of material ruin my entire childhood and cultural experience in there. So I'll talk about some evidence now that kind of supports this in there. There was Donald Appleyard did a famous study showing that social cohesion was inversely proportional to traffic flow, i.e. the more cars you've got going down the street, the less likely everybody is to actually talk to each other. You can look at that one. There's a new bit of research just come out in the UK saying that children in deprived areas are 3 times more likely to be involved in road traffic accidents. There's another stat, another bit of research we've had from London. We've got so much, a lot of it thanks to Rachel in there and others, that car ownership is the greatest indicator of poor health in London, where the majority of people don't drive. The sheer ownership of a car will mean that you get in certain conditions in there. So there's that to unpack. So really what I really want to talk about is network planning and what we do to actually overcome this thing. And I'll talk about Manchester again and what we've done over the past year. I started there. It's a very car-dominated area, as I've highlighted in there. Started working with Chris Boardman, and I said, well, let's start from scratch. I did some network planning sessions with the local councillors, with engineers, with planning, with regen, local cycling advocates, local walking advocates. Got them in a room with a blank pen, blank map, and said, OK, let's look at the situation. I pulled out a red pen and said, tell me everywhere it's bad. This is what I'm recommending elsewhere as well. Tell me all the busy roads, all the rat runs, all the ones that are difficult to cross, all the ones that are difficult to cycle in there, to get people to focus their minds on what they'd actually done to the area and to acknowledge the barriers that we've created. Once that element was finished, I then said, OK, well, let's flip it, let's look at it. Actually, you're telling me that everywhere else is OK. And what we found from doing this network planning session is that 80% of the streets in our urban areas are kind of OK, and that's the good news side of it. We haven't quite ruined everywhere yet. There's still time to actually address the climate change issues. I then pulled out a green pen and said, OK, well, let's plot some crossings across these difficult roads so we can connect the areas that are all right with the other areas that are all right. And we went through that one, and then really the B network process was like join the dots, open up the areas. and say, actually, the immediate place where you live is normally quite all right to walk and cycle, but you don't have to go too far before you come across one of these barriers, and then it's how do you get across it? If you're riding on your bike, you're going to turn around and go, oh my God, I can't take that one. And there's plenty around us now to put into that kind of consideration there. But if we can put a crossing there and you get into the other stuff that's all right on the other side, people can kind of understand how we could put a network together quite simply. And just by strategically placing crossings around Greater Manchester, in 3 years, we said we could open up over a 1,000-mile network that 92% of the population would benefit from. And so that's one of the key things I want to talk about. I also want to mention the economic side of it, and Rachel's made some comments about the problems the car, and it really is. There's some research that's come out from the EU Commission of late that's saying that the true cost of cars, I think they've quantified it across the EU, €1 trillion per year annually. That's how much people are paying to subsidise cars. It has been broken down by the Technical Institute in Dresden for Ireland in there. Don't really know these figures, but you're paying a €3 billion a year bill to subsidise. This is not what car people are paying in taxes. This is the external cost that everybody, every man, woman and child in Ireland right now is paying €650 a year to subsidise cars. And if you're talking that children in deprived areas are 3 times more likely to get hit, they're also much more unlikely to actually own cars. You can see why I've made that social justice issue at the start. We're paying for it, and someone's got to kind of fit that bill. So I'm getting a bit passionate because it's difficult getting these things on the ground. I've spent 20 years trying to build stuff. I'm facing every kind of opposition possible in there. But we seem to be at some kind of tipping point now. Well, the evidence has built up so much and it's so overwhelming, and I'll definitely thank the people around me for that one in there, that people are going, there's no way of avoiding this. We might actually do something for people walking and cycling. Maybe we should give it a try there. That's certainly the case in Manchester and there, where we've gone as far with automobility as most places. So my challenge to you here really is you've got legislation, you've got encouragement, you've got enforcement. All these tools are at your disposal. You need to exercise them now, really, because the planet isn't waiting. And I will say, if you look at the kind of Manchester approach we took to network planning, I've given you a kind of first step how to acknowledge, and I know you've had issues with your kind of more top-down planning of particularly the Dublin cycle network. Perhaps if you invited everybody and you came up with a plan together, because for me, only together really, and only in collaboration can we actually come up with a plan to get out of this mess. And that's my opening statement.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all 3 of you. And I just want to briefly make reference to your final comment there. We have, as you know, the National Transport Authority are trying to roll out the Bus Connects programme. The National Transport Authority, it's a bus network that will provide 230 kilometres of bus lanes and 200 kilometres of segregated cycle lanes on 16 key routes coming into the city. And you probably are aware of, there's been a lot of local resistance in relation to the rollout of that, in particular where trees are proposed to be cut down. So just if you have any, advice to us in relation to how you balance the public interest of ensuring that we have adequate infrastructure in relation to public transport and cycling, as well as the physical changes that we need in order to build this infrastructure. And then a second question for whoever wants to come in on it, just in relation to e-scooters, e-bikes. The Minister for Transport here is carrying out has commissioned a review in relation to the safety that we need to regulate e-scooters here, and that's been carried out by the Road Safety Authority. Just my understanding from France, I know you gave really good figures there, but just from looking at media coverage of it, they're running into problems. I understand the uptake is very good, but there's a lot of lack of maybe regulation, and what you don't want is a situation where you have e-scooters or e-scooters or e-bikes coming on board and they're up on footpaths and there's a lack of regulation, and then you just upset everybody. And you were talking about those who are more disabled, pedestrians, so making sure that there's a whole safety issue and that they're regulated. So those, I suppose, because we're new and we see all these e-scooters now starting to come on board here in Ireland, but it's the regulation which we're working on. But just advice around that and where it has worked well in other jurisdictions. Yeah. Whoever wants to come in on that.
Do you want me to say the first one?
Yeah,
certainly got the most experience of actually getting schemes delivered and facing the opposition and developing tactics to overcome. At one stage in London, we just stopped using the word cycling altogether because it just became so toxic. As soon as we include that word in the consultation, there's a whole bunch of people that reply no automatically. Certainly all the taxi drivers, for example, would be one, and then we're doing a big scramble to get lots of cycle campaigners to say yes, to kind of then balance it out and find out what the real consultation view is. So I've learned a lot over the past 20 years with that, facing several judicial reviews of everything. At one stage, I didn't think I was really doing my job properly unless I ended up in court. And that's one of the things to bear in mind. It's going to be a problem. I was going to do a bit in my talk about change and how reluctant people are to do any kind of change, but I'd say what I've done in Manchester is say, okay, well, sometimes we have to do that battle. You'd be changing like a core corridor, and your main routes into town are certainly that one. You go, this is for the greater good, I'm going to battle and defend. And it's like, what level of consultation are you really doing? You know it needs to happen. You know the overall aims of society in there. You've got to kind of show some strength and make it happen in there. But there's other elements to the Manchester programme as well, like the crossings, for example. Nobody really minds about crossings. Everybody can see the benefit of getting across a difficult road in there. There might be some residual network impact, but it can be quite a winner in there. We've also looked at so-called filtered neighbourhoods and stuff where we stop cars being able to drive through residential cells in there. And if you're doing that kind of approach, then really that's got to be led by the community. You really want that to come out of their mouths. You want them to actually ask for it rather than saying, I'd quite like to filter your area, because that's going to not take you too far in there. But when you're doing the core corridors, just to wrap up there, it's a question of being strong and bold and sticking to it and saying, I asked politicians in London, I said, look, say that you're going to do it, and how do we make the least worst situation for everybody, given that we're going to do it? If you do it, say, should we do this? Then you're going to get an overwhelming opposition in there, and people say, oh, we'd quite like it, but yeah, we understand it in there. It's a question of going, we're going to do it. How do I make sure this doesn't adversely affect your business? How can we keep you doing the things that you do as part of your workplace in there? So I think that's the way. Sometimes you've just got to be strong, and other times you've got to be as collaborative as possible. That's a whole section.
Thank you. Do you want to come in, Dr. Aldred?
Yes, just to add a quick point to what Brian said as well, and making sure that we're hearing from all sections of the community, because consultations, meetings and so on don't necessarily attract everyone. We don't hear enough, for instance, in terms of children's voices. We don't get to hear formally from children in consultations. How can we involve them in decisions being made? Because very often the decisions that adults are making are restricting children's freedom, so trying to extend involvement. I did want to say something on e-scooters and so on, though, and I would agree there is a need for a regulatory framework, but I think when you think about risk in relation to e-scooters and so on, you have to look at it in relation to distance travel, because these are new things. Inevitably, when you go from zero usage, therefore zero injuries, you're going to get an increase in injuries, but it's important to get data on usage, to actually look at the risk and compare it to other modes, and also to look at risk posed to others, because, for instance, when we look at risk posed to others, clearly the main risk to pedestrians is from motor vehicles, and for instance heavy goods vehicles pose a particular risk and so on. So also to look at risk in those terms, and I would be very surprised if those modes pose a higher risk to pedestrians than do motor vehicles. That said, of course, there is a comfort issue. There is an issue of pedestrians feeling comfortable, feeling safe on the footway, and the footway is not the place for light electric vehicles that are travelling at relatively high speeds compared to pedestrians. It's another reason why we need better, safe, protected cycle infrastructure, because very often those kind of devices may fit in cycle lanes, but if you do not have safe cycle lanes, then people are going to use them on the footway, which is not desirable. Therefore, it's another reason to build good cycling infrastructure.
Do you want to come in, Mr. Christer? Are there other jurisdictions where they do e-scooters well, where I suppose they got the regulation right, they started well, it worked well, it rolled out? Because we're at this phase here now in Ireland where we're looking at, the Road Safety Authority is looking at how best to regulate them.
I mean, we don't represent e-scooters, so I can't have an official opinion about that, just a private opinion, if you want to say. I mean, everybody is experimenting with this new mobility device, isn't it? I mean, Germany, France have been coming up with national laws. In Germany, they haven't been even on the road yet, but they have been regulating them, so they took really a strong approach, I would say. As a resident of Brussels, you see many service providers putting these devices on the street. You see problems, obviously, users being on the sidewalks, but I think it's more of a symptom of a failed infrastructure, isn't it? That they are not cycling, or they're not using the cycle lanes, which they should be doing, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. Deputy Lahart. So,
my colleague's going to take a minute at the end, if that's okay.
Okay, so you have 10 minutes. Will I give you an indication there at about 7 minutes? Or?
Yeah, terrific.
Yeah, okay, great.
Thanks a million. Actually, just back from Velo, going down to it later, and it's been really exciting, really stimulating. Your contribution, Brian, was matched by Alex, I think, who from Scotland, who I was really astounded at those figures. The poorer the area, the more likely you are. He mapped it out and showed it in Scotland, the more likely you are to be run over by a car or hit by a car, and also gave the socio-economic reasons behind that. Right. So that you've just reinforced that today. The bus corridors that you've walked into a trap here. See, the government's proposal on the bus corridors here, the real flaw in it is that it is attempting to accommodate the car as well as the bike and public transport. And so we're talking about great, what I call boulevards into the city in some cases, where they would be absolutely destroyed if that proposal was to go forward. So there's, the context is different. Yeah. Just in relation to the e-cars, okay, because I'd like to see what your views are in relation to e-bikes. E-bikes do not figure at all in the government's climate action plan. And coming out of a conference like Velo, and it is only one conference in one city at one stage, you just see that because of the size of our city, the scale of it, the makeup of it, the streets, that actually e-bikes in particular are very well suited. But we have to start, I think, from the bottom in terms of education. Actually, we don't. There's nothing in the government's climate action plan either about educating people in relation to just cycling. Never mind e-cycling. Okay, so there's huge gaps there. Our emissions, particularly in Dublin, are related to transport, and yet again the government's plan puts a heavy focus on electric cars. So you could end up with one form of congestion replacing another form of congestion. And if that's the way we go, that's exactly what will happen, that electric cars will just congest the city in the way diesel and petrol cars do at the moment. So there's very little emphasis on the cycling alternative. One of the things that dismays me as a local public representative at local level for almost 20 years and at national level for moving into 4 years is that what the government has done also is it has given the National Transportation Authority the responsibility to drive the cycling piece. Now, if any agency in this state doesn't have the confidence of the people as a result of the manner in which it has attempted to implement phase 1 and phase 2 of Bus Connects, it is the National Transportation Authority. And again, this is your piece about, Brian, about local democracy. I think transport has to be democratic. People must have an input into it. I must have a say. I like what you were saying, leave out cycling. The first time I've heard the phrase of active transport has been in the last few weeks, and it's a phrase that's kind of growing on me in that regard. Our city bike scheme has become static. Figures-wise, grew exponentially, has been static in the last 2 years. Probably, I suspect, because of safety measures in part. So there's a couple of questions that I want to ask you about, because I mean the whole e-cycling thing goes from the point of view of education to incentivising to tax deductions to tax incentives to infrastructure to safety to parking to planning, all of that, and there is no word of this in the government's climate action plan. So from the development of buildings right through to being able to go to a soccer match and park your e-bike safely. One of the things in the Velo that we were offered was bringing visitors down to Drury Street car park to see our one and only municipal bicycle park in this city. I wouldn't be showing it off to anybody. Fair play to Dublin City Council, they've done something, but we need legislation and regulation that people can go into this city, park their bikes and know the bike will be there when they come back anywhere. And even incentivise the car parks, legislate to force them to actually provide bicycle bays. So, do you have any information on the emission reductions that have come about as a result of a shift in cities to e-bikes or to bikes as opposed to e-vehicles? Is there any emerging trends in that at the moment?
Have you other questions? Just you have two.
No, I'll take that one first.
Oh yeah, okay. Yeah. Just you have two. If you want to ask the questions, because I want to keep your kind of. Okay, if you can do a short answer back, if you want to do it that way, just I want to keep them within a 10 minutes slot, if that's possible, so as short as you can, so it gives them a chance to ask other questions. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, that the e-bikes missing from the climate action plan, that was pretty much the very point of my intervention. So I totally agree. It's not a balanced electromobility strategy that you find in this plan. I think you have the objective of having more than 900,000 e-vehicles on the roads by 2030, but there's not a single word about e-bikes, and I think that's really a shame. That's a missed opportunity. In my intervention, I spoke about fiscal incentives that have been given in various member states, for example, in France. Yeah, this was this slide. Yeah, this €200 purchase subsidy per e-bike, and that really had a very positive effect on sales figures in France. And you see that 61% of these new e-bike trips replace car trips. I assume the French authorities will be also able to do a calculation of how much CO2 that saved. But I don't have this figure right now. I can't.
I think there's a figure from Austria yesterday, Vilo, that the transfer to e-bikes represented a saving of 13,000 tonnes of carbon per year in one particular area.
Right. Yeah.
Can you just develop the theme, this will be my final question, thanks Chair, about the reluctance of women to cycle? You mentioned it briefly there, but if you could develop that, and obviously the children too, I think the real measure of safe cycleway is if you can allow a child of 11 or 12 onwards cycle independently. What can we do? Again, there's no mention of it in the climate action plan because, you know, women represent half of the population. And then an addendum to that, how have businesses fared in cities where e-bikes and cycling has been encouraged and have replaced cars and car parking spaces, etc.? What has businesses' reaction been to that?
Again, if I could ask you to keep it short.
Yeah.
Sure. Just very briefly on that other point, I can send links to studies as well looking at e-bikes and emissions reductions. There is quite a lot of research. In terms of women and cycling, yes, this is for me, it's a really important equity issue, because if we look at countries where there's a lot of cycling, for instance, the Netherlands, Denmark and Germany, then cycling is gender equal. Women do want to cycle. When the conditions are right, women cycle in some contexts even more than men do. If you look at the Netherlands, it's actually men in their 20s that have a dip in cycling. So clearly women do want to cycle. If you look at the Netherlands again, you have around half of all trips to school are by bike. That's incredible. And in countries where that doesn't happen, children are basically having to go to school by car often. They don't have the option of cycling. So clearly there is a big need for it. Now, I led a systematic review looking at studies around preferences for bike infrastructure and looking at this by gender. And we reviewed over 50 studies. And we found that in most of these studies, there was a clear difference in that both genders wanted separated infrastructure, but women had a particularly strong preference. So clearly, if we build protected cycleways, that's good for everyone, but it's particularly important for women. I've also led a study that looked at cycling with children, and you can see that when people are cycling with children, the bar is raised again. So we need that really good infrastructure. It also needs to be direct, because as distance increases, the propensity to cycle goes down. It's called a distance decay curve. And that curve is particularly steep for women. So if we say, OK, we'll send people around the houses, around 3 sides of the square to avoid the busy road, that particularly puts off women and older people, because they then have to cycle further. So it's kind of a double whammy. But women will cycle if we get it right, but we need to provide safe, direct, separated routes. Another point is, don't just build for commutes. Women's trips, more than men's trips, often involve trip chaining, so maybe to the school, to the shop, to work and so on. So we don't just need to build routes to commute destinations, we also need to make sure that routes around school schools to shops and so on are also safe. So building for destinations. I think those would be my main points.
Thank you. Deputy Chambers, you've 1 minute there.
No,
Thank
thanks,
you.
Chair. No, I just actually following up on your comment there. It goes back to bus connects, and I suppose if you're looking at our future urban strategy around transport, the focus is very much buses, and there's a subordination of cycle lanes, despite there being cycle lanes in the bus plan, and that feeds into your point around trip chaining, because the bus plan is very much about central arteries and ignoring the alternative connectivity within communities. So do you think, as public representatives, but as policymakers, that we should be reviewing that in the context of not having it as a bus connects plan, but as a general transport connect plan, so that you equalise cycling as an alternative, as well as having bus transport obviously improved, but that you don't have a subordination within the plan, so that you would facilitate connectivity and trip chaining, as you've mentioned. That's my main comment, just to see how we could improve future cycling capacity in terms of our public transport plan, because Bus Connects doesn't do that. It's all about central arteries and kind of ignoring capital investment in the, say, communities that aren't in the central pillars of the bus lane development.
On that, Mr. Deacon.
That's very much central to London's approach, like the Healthy Streets methodology is walking, cycling and public transport in there. We acknowledge that like half the walking trips in London are related to public transport. So even like if you look at the Netherlands, and most of the cycling works there because of the train system in there. So if they're not integrated together as an active travel system, I think you've got a problem there. And one of the main focuses in London at the moment is to do bus corridors, but to do bus cycle only corridors with just like a local freight access, but no through movement for private motor vehicles. That's really a model that we're pushing in there, and that fits under the kind of Healthy Streets objectives from the Mayor there. So yeah, I'd say look at that again. It's got to be one system. You can't go, we do buses, we do cycling, we do pedestrians. That's a road to ruin that, because you're just going to keep wobbling stuff backwards and forwards in there. It's got to work for all three, and the one that misses out when you're allocating the space and you're not knocking down the buildings, that's got to be the private car. That's a system that works adequately.
Lombard.
Thanks, Chair. I'd like to welcome the presentation this afternoon on where we're going with our cycling strategy. I think we've had, and I'm probably not going to be negative now, I think it's very, very proactive that we need to have this debate regarding cyclists and where we're going to go with the actual, how we're going to promote it. But if you look at Ireland and look at Ireland's dispersed population, we'd be slightly different now to areas such as London and Manchester. Population densities would be very, very low in my part of the world, really rural, very dispersed populations. Where do you see the rural aspect of this coming in? Where do you see safety issues regarding rural transportation, rural cycling, rural roads? Issues about cycling to near a shop could be 10, 12 miles away, depending where you live on the further side of my constituency. It is an issue regarding the actual dispersed nature of the Irish population itself. So could I ask about the rural implications, and where do you feel that strategy can be improved to ensure we do have the option and the benefit of going forward with that?
I do, yeah. Sorry.
And then on the other side, and I think when you look at urban planning itself and how we're building our infrastructure regarding, in particularly our industries, whether it's local authorities, whether it is manufacturing, cycling to work is something we need to be promoting. But on the other side, if you look at Ireland, we would have rainfall every year of nearly 40 inches. You'd have 160 days of wet weather on average, slightly different than the actual continent. Urban planning regarding putting in place the amenities for people who want to actually cycle to work, to actually comfortably cycle to work depending on the weather, and then have the ability to change. Has there been a major change in cities like London and Manchester regarding urban design and urban design of the buildings to accommodate that actual cyclist itself?
Sorry, actually, Deputy Deary wanted a few questions, very briefly, and a related question, and then I'll come back to the panel.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. And a related question, I suppose, where I was coming from is kind of follow on from Senator Lombard. I recall when I was going to school, and we're probably all in the same situation. There's not a lot of difference between most of us, I suppose, this side of the fence. The cycle to school was a thing we all did. and I was very healthy. But nowadays when we go to school, every mammy and daddy wants not to know drive their little Johnny or Mary up to school, but they want to drive them into the classroom. And that has created a huge difficulty from school's point of view, but also from a transport point of view. What do you see maybe a way around that? I think if we start at that age, kids going to school, as an education process with everything else, I know roads have got a lot busier, which is obvious, but there must be a way whereby that can be reversed in some way. It's not that long ago since we were all doing that, and I don't recall that many serious accidents at that particular time, and little Johnny and little Mary went to school and got home from school safe and sound and was far healthier.
Thank you. That's great. So whoever wants to come in whatever order, Dr. Aldred.
If I start, just on that, one of the policies that is being used very effectively in Scotland and in England outside some schools is school streets, where you don't let people drive through that street when children are arriving at or leaving the school, and that makes a massive difference. Suddenly the children can be safe in their own street on the way to school. That has made a big difference. Just on the rural context, it is worth looking at the length of trips that are made in Ireland, and I think that clearly some trips, trips are longer in rural areas, the population is more dispersed, but still half of trips made by people living outside of Dublin are under 8 kilometres. There are still quite a lot of trips that could potentially be switched, and there are, if you look for instance in the Netherlands, rates of cycling in rural areas are very high, and they're similar to rates of cycling in urban areas. Now, the urban design implications are potentially somewhat different to exactly what you do in urban areas, but there are interventions that you can make around safe cycleways, safe routes in rural areas that do make it possible for people to cycle there. So it's not, there is a possibility to shift trips, not as many as in inner city Dublin, but there is still a possibility, but things need to change. Many of those rural roads, if you have to mix with motor traffic, it's very intimidating, speeds are often very high, so the context for cycling is often more hostile.
Yeah. Can I just come in?
Yes, absolutely.
Just on the business side of things there, and particularly the rural communities or anywhere, really, there's like small rural communities in Spain, for example, you like Pontevedra, that kind of ban cars, and everybody wants to go there and do business and live there and get on there. When Google came to Camden in London, they came there, and the managing director said, I'm coming here because the cycle infrastructure is great. I spent 15 years building that one and didn't get any money, but it's what kind of a business you're attracting, and most rural areas will want some kind of business in there. And if all you're offering is my family's from rural Ireland, Kilmessan area, so I know the situation well. All you're offering is no footways and 60 mile an hour roads in there that are barely wide enough to fit anything from there. It's not a place to go and set up and do business. And Ireland is beautiful. You've got a lot of green, natural capital. People want to live in these areas, but not if they don't have a choice for active travel. And that's a way of bringing business in there, and that's, I think, a way of selling it to rural communities as well.
Mr. Kuster.
Just to comment on the weather conditions. I have lots of colleagues from the Mediterranean area, and as I can tell you, they complain all the time about the bad weather in Brussels. It always rains. But the weather in Brussels is very similar to the weather in the Netherlands, and there it doesn't put people off from cycling. So I think it's just a matter of clothing.
But regarding the urban design, though.
Of attitude. There was an article a couple of years ago in The Guardian that listed 10 arguments that put people off from cycling. The first 7 reasons, I think, were related to road safety, and only argument number 10 was the weather and hilly topography. So I think it's an argument we hear time and again, but it has been refuted many times.
Yeah,
as well.
yeah. I think my point was not about being negative about the actual cycling industry. I think it was about maybe the lack of urban design to actually accommodate people who cycle to work. And I think the lack of urban design, even at local authority level. I'll give you an example. The Corcoran Council Local Authority has 900 people working in one building. If you cycle to work tomorrow morning, you can't shower there. Obviously, and this is a new building built in 2006. So what I'd be kind of saying, in the urban design of what we're proposing for our urban towns and villages where there's infrastructure, are we putting enough emphasis on to ensure a cyclist can come to work and have the amenities where to park, where to shower, where to change? Because, with deepest respect to Belgium or to Brussels, it's slightly different here regarding, if you were here last Sunday, you'd know what rain was. Do you know?
Yeah, just to come in on the urban design, I work for an urban design practice, so definitely, yeah. And I'm part of, like, do the judging for Club Peloton's, like, Cycle-Friendly Developers Awards, so we're really trying to promote that in the UK. I used to work in finance in the City of London, and most people are riding in on bikes there, and these are high earners and they want to get there and they need the facilities there, and there's some amazing facilities in there. Just it's not often seen by people because it's inside the office blocks in there. So again, it's the sort of people that you want to encourage and the sort of businesses you want to attract in there. If they haven't got the facilities, they won't set up there, and if it's not included as part of your planning regulations, and if you don't think it's happening here in Ireland, that probably means it isn't. And it's certainly like it is happening in the UK to a large extent, particularly with the high earners in there, but even that's not too well known about. We're probably going to put out a best practice manual in Manchester soon to kind of promote that. So we're going to look at, like, shower facilities changing. There's some amazing examples in there, and a lot of housing developments in London now are putting a premium on houses being like and blocks being car free. And you actually pay extra for it because the cycling facilities are there and the walking's there. Certainly the new developments in Waltham Forest are going on that one. So it's a real, people want that kind of car-free living. This is what millennials are after. They don't want to sit in a car with the stress of driving all day, waiting for the heart attacks to come on there. They need to be out there, and you'll attract a certain type of people and a certain type of profession by encouraging that one. So look at your planning regulations in there to make sure that's true and exert some influence.
Thank you. Senator Devine.
Thank you for the presentation. Just to go back, I suppose, to the infrastructure, because we need to start at the basics. Like Dublin has developed recently in the last 20 odd years, apartment living. It's something that we're not used to, and yet there's nothing there for bikes. You look up and you see them precariously dangling from balconies and terraces, and somebody to actually think about getting a bike and take it all the way up those stairs and back down again. It's really difficult, easier in a house, but we haven't, and like even in Leinster House here, our bike stand, there's no covered shelter. We haven't got that far in thinking that this is a priority and the encouragement of it, and it is about infrastructure. When we got the Lewis in, the Lewis has transformed our city. We're very proud of it. It's kind of made it a very smart looking city too, but I fell off, and loads of, the incidents of people with broken limbs, getting stuck in their bikes, getting stuck in the ruts of the tram line. That wasn't thought about, and that's only 15 years ago. That wasn't thought about, and yet the accidents, and they're still going on today. So while trying to accommodate a Lewis, a traffic and a bus altogether, the infrastructure of the tram lines, the road, doesn't provide, doesn't even think, I suppose, of the safety, and we need to get to actually thinking of that and prioritising that, and maybe deprioritising the car, as you said. Cynically as well, I think about the regulation, and I know you said you couldn't do it publicly, but privately, what you would like to see being regulated. We have the scooters that are becoming popular in Dublin. We've over 2,000 now. Unregulated. E-bikes, I've only seen a handful of them. I don't think they're that popular, and the handful I've seen in the city, about 3 of them are homemade, so they're important. But if we regulate them, the cynic in me leaves the room open for commercial enterprise interests, insurance interests, to come in and lobby for the toughest regulation, when I don't think we need that. I think we need allow people to discover these new modes of transport. They're tweaked from previous. They have a potential, as does cycling, has a potential for risk and danger, but I don't want to see us go around of answering to insurance companies, because it's another greening of their company, but it's also a way of making an awful lot of money. So helmets, all that stuff, and we'll wait for the RSA to come back with their recommendations, but certainly the cynicism in me would say that it's an opportunity to be jumped on to make more money out of people, when really it's something that we've done for hundreds of years, but we've just kind of progressed with mechanisation of it, so it'd be important to watch out for that. Yes, I still go back to the weather as well. The weather in this country is miserable most of the time, can be very miserable, and as a cyclist, I wouldn't want to cycle in the rain. So we need to think about what happens when I and thousands of others stop cycling and decide to use public transport that day. How are the public transport systems coping with that? Do they make adjustments on just the climate itself on a day-to-day basis? Because it is unpredictable. It's very, very unpredictable. Yesterday we had a community walkabout where the Lewis runs, and it's where the new Children's Hospital is. So there's a lot of interest in being shown to be community friendly. So we're getting some community benefit of providing cycling, walking and Lewis all combined, and we as a community have an opportunity to just say what it is that we want. We talked about covered cycle lanes. I don't know how feasible it is, but in certain pockets it would be. So we're looking into that, but certainly in the Liberties area to create permeability, with Guinness's as the leading investor in social housing, or not social housing, in housing there, are interested in providing covered walkways so we can actually walk when it's pouring out of the heavens, which it does fairly often. I'm also interested, Rachel, in talking about women's cycling and going back to the research, but it's really interesting perhaps for everybody. But bloomers were actually very good for women. The introduction of bloomers allowed us to cycle, got rid of the bustles, the heavy material and the long skirts, but still the reluctance for women, and that's replicated, I think, in the reluctance of women being in public places necessarily in dark times, dark evenings, and not feeling safe. So we need to address that at all times. Women take on the burden, mostly, if it's a burden, maybe that's the wrong word, of dropping and collecting kids and trying to accommodate the bigger, I don't know what you call them, to put on the bikes, to put the small children into, how wide they can be, how safe that's going to be on our roads. But certainly we don't just hop on our bike and go to work. It's doing about 20 different messages before then, and in particular, yeah.
2 minutes left just for answers, just so you know.
Children, okay, yeah, I think Sinead asked if you could just, it's more a lot of comments and a couple of questions.
It's more a response, I think, to those comments. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll come in on the infrastructure.
Yeah.
In fact, a few I'm finally answering some infrastructure questions. Particularly in trams, I had the pleasure of meeting an engineer from Amsterdam who put the first cycle tracks in way back in the 60s. And I was like, well, why did you do the kind of famous Dutch style? So because we had trams,
right,
I needed to line cyclists up so they could cross them perpendicular.
Right.
So that was like the whole reason for segregation in the first place. I work in Manchester. We have a similar issue with the trams there, and segregation does help on that. We have like the perpendicular crossing rule is one of the things we use in engineering to make sure you can get them as straight as possible, and also the clearance rule in there, like you want to be at least 2.2 metres from the edge of the tram line before you put the cycling infrastructure in there, and if you can't manage that, then you need to disaggregate the network somehow in there. So there's a few kind of like engineering tips I can give, and I can send stuff over there.
Right.
But really, like it makes the case for segregation if you've got trams in there, so then you can control the point. If people are weaving and doing that sideways hop, which I'm quite good at myself from riding around in Manchester, but it's an advanced skill, and we can't rely on most people to do it in there. So yeah, there are tips we can give. Thanks.
Yes, and just something that came up there, and is also a theme that's mentioned before, is around kind of mainstreaming active travel into all areas of planning and ensuring it's not seen as an afterthought. And we've had that problem in London, that you get new infrastructure, we finally get new good infrastructure, and then it gets dug up by a water company and everything goes to pot. So it has to be in there, it has to be part of everything, it has to be in the planning. And just on the gender and cycling issue, it's particularly important often for women and other currently underrepresented groups in cycling to have access to cycling, because if you think about women as a group, women tend to have lower car access than men, they tend to earn less than men. You know, having this low-cost form of personal mobility is particularly important. So again, it's kind of double disadvantage, the fact that the way that our roads are designed particularly excludes women.
Sherlock.
Yeah, thank you. This has been very interesting so far, and thank you for your contributions today, because it certainly has broadened my perspective in relation to the issue of cycling and what can be delivered. One of the things that strikes me, though, from listening to you all, and there seems to be a common denominator from my interpretation of what you've said, is that from a cultural point of view, if you take Cambridge or Brussels or Manchester, that there's a cultural shift shift in the mindset of policy makers at ground level, at local authority level, at government level, towards wanting to make this happen. So they're now embracing this as a concept and as a clear policy provision. The challenge we have in this country is that shifting the psychology towards creating the infrastructure. And the question I have really is how do we, what is it that Brussels can do? I lived in Brussels, and I used to cycle everywhere. And if you literally, you move from city centre Brussels into Flanders countryside, and it's cycling heaven, effectively, because, the cyclist is king or queen, so to speak. And, it's just a cultural mindset that favours the cyclist, whereas in this country, the car is king or queen, and if I have a car, I have the God-given right to go anywhere, and I own the public thoroughfare, and everybody else is incidental to that, to my enjoyment of my vehicle. It's how do we get policymakers at the local authority level to shift their thinking and their psychology away from designing infrastructure? Because in my experience as a former member of a local authority and now as a member of this House, everything was designed by engineers. And I do not want to criticise engineers in any way, okay, but they think in straight lines A to B. And you don't have architects or town planners input. What advice can you give us in respect of seeking to shift that mindset within the local authority paradigm, for want of a better word? Where do we get the paradigm shift? How do we do it? That's the first question.
Yeah, I can comment. Yeah, that's completely in my zone, that one. Yeah, so one, I'm a highway engineer, and I've kind of been through that journey actually to start thinking about designing around people. And that's what I explain to engineers in there. They're all trained. Don't know what you're trained in either, but design manual for roads and bridges is fairly international in there. There's no footways in there, there's no pedestrian crossings, there's no cycling in there. Everybody's coming out trained to deliver roads and bypasses in there, and they're highly skilled at doing it and managing it in there. Then I have to come along and go, okay, well, I need to retrain you. You're actually working on streets where people are there. So this is the kind of technical way that I come in there, and I have to go, well, like, let's design for a child. One of the things I say to engineers to talk in their language is like, this is the way a child sees the world. They can't perceive kind of speech in there. As you get older, your depth of focus gets wider and wider. So a child can't tell the difference between a car approaching at 40 miles an hour or 20 miles an hour because they've got that. And there's medical journals on this one in there. So you've got to think about the visibility display of a child if you're designing a street, because children are going to be on there and they're going to want to cross in there, and it kind of makes a very strong, compelling case for 20 miles an hour and moves against the kind of paradigms of like, actually, if we slow cars down, that's bad for air quality, and we need to keep as many moving through the system as possible. You've got to look at the different design parameters of other vehicles. We could talk all day about the cycling design vehicle and how we establish that in practice in there. So that's the kind of technical side, and that's a large part of what I do, to go around engineers and retrain them in there. There's like, on the political side, that's why I've got people like Chris Boardman to help and sell the case on a kind of larger policy level. And some of the stuff we've been talking about here, like climate change, air quality, like regeneration, economic vitality, we can start selling it in that kind of a situation.
So you pull in advocates, so like the Boardmans of this world, they begin to change the mindset because they're influencers, they're stars, so to speak, to borrow that awful phrase that's been used by Mr. Johnson and so co. But like, he brings, you bring in the stars, so to speak, they begin to influence the politicians, and then you see it flowing within the system.
It's absolutely that, but it's also about you can make champions as well. I remember when I was at Camden, we had like a new exec member for the environment in the first day. We got him on cycle training, and we just started indoctrinating him over the next few months. This guy could do it. He's young, he's bright, he's sharp in there. Got him to meet the Camden Cycling Campaign every week. They were working on him. Eventually, he became like Labour's leading spokesperson for cycling in there. And so you can make people in there. It's a question of looking locally, who's closest to getting the agenda, and then like make the champion you need.
I'd love to talk forever. I've only 5 minutes. Can I get the Brussels and Cambridge experience on that? Because Cambridge is a university town. Brussels arguably is it's a cosmopolitan stroke university, very international city as well. But the Cambridge, like where you have a lot of students, it's easier to roll out a cycling infrastructure. I imagine, you know what I mean? So when you talk about the Cambridge busway and cycleways project, where you're moving out into rural areas, that it's a bit like Galway, where you've, the car is still king in Galway, but you have a lot of students who, use their bikes, but you can plan because there's a population base for it that demands it. The demand is there, if you will. It's how do you get the local authority in Cambridge to buy into what you're doing? I imagine it's a lot easier than a city like Manchester or London.
I mean, to be honest, in Cambridge, it has been a struggle there too, because I think they took it for granted to some extent because people cycle partly because driving there is such a nightmare in the centre of historic Cambridge. But in terms of the busway cycleway as well, it also links up a major employer, a major health service employer. There's a clear demand. But I think one interesting question is how to measure potential demand in a context where you don't already have lots of cycling. And that's one tool that I was involved in developing in England and Wales called the Propensity to Cycle tool, where we actually the tool helps us measure the amount of short, relatively flat trips that could more easily be switched to cycling. So we can actually measure what might be the potential demand for cycling in different parts of that country and along specific routes. And that really helps because it is a major problem. If you can't just look out and say there's lots of cyclists, people will think, oh, it's too rainy, it's too long, it's too hilly, and actually to be able to make some measure of that is important. So I think that's sort of trying to get that into planning, that we do have.
Can you plug and play that tool into any scenario?
The code is open source, so somebody who can use that code could then do so with origin destination data from any context. So you could do, but you could actually also do a cruder version if you had some information about those trips. The principle would still hold, but the code is up there.
Okay, thanks.
Mr. Kuster?
I mean, one argument we always hear from local authorities is that they are short on money. Yeah. They have never the resources, they say, to really provide for the facilities that people need to walk and cycle safely. So I think that's where the national government also has an obligation. Huh? I mean, you said 10% that you want to allocate to cycling infrastructure and give it to local authorities. Huh? Give them co-fund local projects, give them 50, 60, 70, 80%. And they will not miss out on that money. I'm sure about that. They will use that and they will submit projects to get that national co-funding.
And in the Netherlands, that 7% that they've reached, are the local authorities driving that?
In the Netherlands, it's the vast majority of the money comes from the local authorities and from the provinces.
And from the provinces.
Yeah. There's also some central government funding, but it's a small part of that 7%.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Thank you. Deputy Eamon Ryan.
Which I think has been very useful, Chair. I think what I would suggest is if it's possible for our clerk and our team to do it, maybe just to go back over the transcript what was said here and where there are key recommendations, particularly in relation to our climate plan, or the National Energy and Action Climate Plan, the likes of including e-mobility and so on. I think it would be very useful that we would just collate those, we would refer them to both the Department of Transport and the Department of Climate Action and ask would they consider in the iterations they say they're doing in our climate plan, would we include those? I think that would be very useful output from this.
Members, yeah, I think that'd be useful.
Can I just ask some very direct questions then? Firstly, of Dr. Aldred. You cited there 2 examples of how you might do trials and temporary improvements. We're stuck. We've been 7 years planning a Liffey cycle route. Geez, it takes time. I was just interested when you said there are trials and temporary measures. If you just give me some practical examples of that, or even locations, would be very useful. But secondly, I was very interested in what you saw, that bus and bike on rural roads. You mentioned just briefly there that you say there's some interesting stuff going on around bus and bike routes on rural roads, and just give some more details on that if you can. I'll come to Mr. Keegan next, or Mr. Deegan next.
Sure. On the trials and temporary improvements, there's quite a few examples. I mean, one from outer London that I studied myself was in the London Borough of Waltham Forest, where they're basically putting in planters and bollards to remove through motor traffic from neighbourhoods. And the first one they did, that was done as a trial, and they measured what happened to motor traffic levels, they measured what happened to walking and cycling levels, and so on. So basically then the community could input if there were planters in the wrong place, if it didn't quite work, they could move stuff around. So that was a nice example of a neighbourhood improvement. In terms of sort of bigger scale stuff, you've got things like Times Square in New York, where they removed motor traffic from a big public square, and they did that in a temporary manner. There's examples also of cycleways that have been done using materials that are cheap and quick and can easily be moved. So there's, for instance, in Mexico City, they've created a lot of cycleways relatively cheaply by bolting down these big yellow blocks to mark out the cycleway. So there's lots of things you can do in small streets, but also even on major roads, to do things relatively quickly and cheaply and see what happens. Around rural roads, I think I was more thinking of active travel than buses specifically, but if you look at what has been done in rural roads...
Oh, you mean connecting by bike to the local bus? Is that what you mean on that? Or?
I was more talking about designing rural cycle routes, but yes, public transport connections can be really important. I mean, when we've been looking at cycling potential in parts of England, for instance, and in the more rural parts where you have longer trips, then clearly being able to cycle to a train station, being able to cycle to a bus station, to a bus stop potentially, and so on, could be quite important. And some of those areas as well, you get a lot of driving to the local train station, and there could be a lot of scope for taking cars off the road and lots of reduction in parking pressure. So I think when you're considering potential for cycling and walking in rural areas, then potentially quite a lot of it could be in combination with public transport.
Right. Mr. Deegan, in terms of Manchester, everyone's been following with interest the big €1.5 billion programme Chris Boardman and yourself rolling out. What's the modal split at the moment in cycling? Has it increased in recent years? How much have you started spending? That's over a 10-year period, I think, wasn't it, by recollection? What are you actually spending this year, and what are you spending on?
Sure, yeah. OK, let's unpack this one. Yeah, the £1.5 billion is over 10 years, but if I can spend it sooner, I would. Now that I really want to front end there. So far, we've got 160 million that's been allocated. In terms of what's been spent so far, not much, around about £1 million so far, because there's a lot of planning involved with cycling. It shouldn't take as long as it does, because you have to do so much persuasion in there. Well, there's lots of different reasons in there, and I won't give all the excuses now. It'll probably be another year before we start hitting the ground with real solid interventions, and then it's about keeping that fed and keeping the machine going, and it kind of grows exponentially. At the moment, we're trying to design up the vast majority of schemes, so we've got a pipeline that we can keep feeding and say, actually, people want this. People have asked us for £300 million worth of stuff with just designs we've got on the table in there, and that really helps going to the Department for Transport, because I know money's often the problem, but it's never really been the problem with cycling in the UK. It's getting people to spend it, because there's so much drama involved in it, and it's easier not doing it. As soon as you do a cycling scheme, okay, well, your comms budget's going to have to go, because you're going to have to defend all the negative comments back on it. So it's getting people into the habit of doing it, and doing that first good thing that then people say, okay, let's have more of that. That was like my first 10-year plan in London, to get something that somebody liked and wanted something more of. It's like a real milestone moment that we only really achieved 4 or 5 years ago with the East-West and North-South superhighway. So I'm at that point in Manchester going, do something good, and then an amazing thing happens. People actually like the schemes that you've done. It mightn't seem like that on the way, but Waltham Forest would not go back to letting all those cars through from that trial now. People will never go back. We wouldn't go back to smoking in pubs again. It's that sort of thing. A culture, getting into the culture change, it's like behaviour over time, and we can change. We've changed within our lifetimes, and it can change quickly again. Now, what did it take? 6 years to get an iPhone in half the people's hands on the planet? Stuff can happen in there. I've got a little bit off tap there, because I didn't want to give you all the full figures on Manchester.
What's the modal share of cycling? What's the recent statistics?
We say 3%, but really it's knocking in between that area from the census data.
We'll race you over the next 10 years. We'll race Dublin versus Manchester.
Challenge accepted.
We will definitely. We shall win.
Ryan?
Last question, if I can, to Mr. Custer. One final wrap question, if I can. Why did Britain get the green light from the European Cyclists Federation on the National Energy and Climate Action Plan? What are they doing that we could and should be doing in our own National Energy and Climate Action Plan? And then second question is in relation to Netherlands, where you're 36% modal share of all trips, as I understand at the moment. What are you aiming for in 2030? Where do you go from here? I don't know if you're Dutch. Sorry, I presume you are. Okay.
No, I can't speak for the Netherlands. I think they have an objective of still growing the number of cyclists by 20%. So they still want to go further. Why did we put the UK on the top? Because they committed to a given budget to spend during this parliamentary term, 2017 to 2021, I think was 1.2 billion pound. They have a clear objective to increase cycling. I think you want to double the stages of cycling between now and 2024. Yeah. And there was a clear reference and commitment to do that. So that's why we put them on the top.
Okay. Can I have one last question, Chair, if I can, of all three, if I can? You've been here with Velo City Conference in the last few days. I presume you've been cycling around Dublin. I got a chance to. We're missing the bloody parade now out in Clontarf, which is a real pity. But what's your impression of cycling around Dublin? I know that Danish mayor, I think, rightly called us out yesterday morning. He, poor fellow, went down the quays and came back with a state of shock. But what's your sense of the city as a cycling city?
It's been a bit of a struggle, to be honest. I mean, I went up to Dublin City University to examine a PhD Viva the first day on Monday, and I was kind of on the road mixing with kind of busy, fast-moving motor traffic. Then I was on the footway, weaving around pedestrians, on the shared footway. It was legal. And then I was meant to be back on the road again. So it's kind of like that sort of infrastructure that doesn't really work for anyone. If you're fearless and want to be on the road, like the 1%, then that's not for you. And if you don't want to mix with motor traffic, it's not for you either, because you have to keep getting back onto the road. So it was a bit familiar to experiences cycling in some of the UK as well, but it didn't really work. What you clearly needed on a road like that was a safe, protected cycleway for everyone, not to be on the footway a bit and to be on the road a bit.
Yeah, my impressions are a little bit more positive, but then I do spend a lot of time riding around Manchester, and we could definitely give you a run for your money on stuff. I've seen some real positive stuff in there. I like the light segregation, the orcas. Down there, I think that's really improved the route. It is a little bit like off and on, that one, because mostly we've been going that way to the conference and back. I had a good walk round, and I've ridden around Dublin quite a bit in the past, and there's some really nice bits. I saw just near Temple Bar, there was like springy bollards just effectively filtering the whole street, so people were walking, cycling around there, and it's a really nice ride through there. That's as good as you'll find anywhere, I think. So. What I often try to do is look at the positive, because I'm defending the engineering community here, and there's lots of good stuff, and you want people to say, okay, that's good, can we have more of it? I think that's the stage we're at there, rather than it's all terrible, and there's been a lot of that. And he's not looked at every street, he's not looked at all your interventions, he's not ridden all the routes. I know there's great stuff around there, and I go, actually, that bit's good, and it's getting to the point where I go, this is good, it works, let's do more of that. And there's plenty of good stuff around there, and it's a bit like London used to be, and certainly central London and the rest of the UK is, you'll find brilliant pockets everywhere. It's a question of going, actually, this bit works, let's unpack it, let's get the evidence, and let's roll this things out. So I think you've got some good stuff. There's been some nice junction treatments in there. I think the pedestrian crossings work a lot better than they do in the UK. There's certain regulations that you've got that are better than ours there. So there's lots to build on. It's a question of finding something that works for you in the right street context, and then rolling it out as part of a plan. So go on, that's my impression.
Thank you very much. And very briefly,
misconception. Dublin is drier than Amsterdam, and it's a hell of a lot warmer than Copenhagen, and it's not as sweltering as Rome. It's a bloody great place to cycle, and we will be like the Danes and the Dutch in 20, 30 years' time. If we spend 10% per annum in the next 10, 20 years, it will transform life in this city and this country. That's where we're going to go.
And on that note, the Joint Committee is adjourned until Wednesday, the 10th of July. Thank you very much for coming before us this afternoon.